My brothers and sisters, on this Monday of the third week of Advent, our countdown to Christmas continues. And our readings also continue to prepare us, or help us to prepare for the coming of Christ at Christmas. In the gospel reading we just listened to, we see the chief priests and elders coming to Jesus to ask a question. You know, throughout his ministry, Jesus got asked many questions, many of them by different people. And his answer always depended on what he perceived to be the intention of the questioner. Some of the questions that were put to him, he answered directly. Some others, he redirected the question. The question that was put to him here, he saw clearly the bad will of the questioners. You see, what happened before our gospel reading, in Matthew's gospel, if you remember, first was the triumphant entry into Jerusalem, where the crowds acclaimed him as the Messiah. And then after that, he went into the temple and cleansed the temple, drove out all those who were turning the temple into a marketplace, a place of business. And then he began teaching. That is why they asked him, by what authority are you doing these things? These things. Triumphant entry, the people are claiming him, and he's refusing to ask them to shut up. He's cleansing the temple. These are the things. And then, of course, he's teaching the people. And so, in this case, instead of answering the question put to him, he answered with a question of his own. And they were caught in a dilemma. There is no answer they will give that Christ wouldn't catch them. If they recognize that the baptism of John the Baptist was from God, they themselves knew it. But they didn't want to acknowledge it because it wasn't convenient for them. If on the other hand, they said that it was from human, then the question is, the people knew that John the Baptist was a true prophet that came from God. So they didn't want to fall into, to turn the people against themselves. And so they lied. We don't know, he said. They knew, but they didn't want to answer. And because they didn't answer his question, Jesus also refused to answer their own. But in the process, I think he is teaching us an important lesson. We will always find people around us who are critical of everything we do, even when their criticism is irrational, totally irrational. How do you respond to that? How do you respond to irrationality, especially when it is directed at you? Because Jesus saw the irrationality of the question they were asking, he did not answer. You cannot engage everybody that criticizes you, even especially when the criticism is irrational. And this is the example that Christ set for us, the way he dealt with the scribes and Pharisees and their questions. They knew, they are familiar with their own scriptures. They knew all the prophecies about the Messiah. They knew that Christ has ticked all the boxes. But because their own authority is threatened, they would not acknowledge that Christ is the Messiah. And of course, they're the ones who lost. You know, eventually, they continued until they crucified him. And they thought that by crucifying him, they have solved their problem. But their problem was only beginning. Their problem was only beginning because after they crucified him, his disciples continued to spread that message that he brought. And despite every opposition and persecution, they continued to this day. Those scribes and Pharisees, how many of them are remembered today? They're just remembered for their opposition. None of them is remembered by name. But we remember the names of the apostles. Those they tried to stop but couldn't stop. You know, there was an admonition that Gamaliel, the rabbi, gave to those authorities at the beginning of the church in the Acts of the Apostles. When he told them they wanted to stop the apostles to stop preaching the name of Jesus, Gamaliel told them, you have to be careful, because if this is from God, you cannot stop it. You may find yourself fighting against God, but if it is not from God, leave them alone. They will destroy themselves. If they themselves had listened to the advice of one of them, to them, the story would have been different for them. We thank God as we continue to prepare for for the Christmas, for Christ coming into our lives. We have to make room for God in our lives, whether it is convenient or inconvenient. This is something that the scribes and the Pharisees refused to do. They were only concerned about, their convenience. They asked questions to embarrass Jesus, but the questions they were asking, they know the answer. They had bad will. Let us never act towards anybody with bad will, because